can tell, the activity has declined to some degree. I'm still hearing about reports in Europe, but yeah, nothing like the frenzy we had last month and the month before that. This has pretty much been going on for 2 months. Yeah, I've noticed a sharp decline in the media coverage at least, but I suspect there is still activity to some extent.
Someone on here is asking about Bob Lazar. Have you done much research related to Bob over the years?
Oh, certainly. I mean, it's hard not to in this field. I think anyone who's been involved with ufology for any length of time knows about Bob Lazar. I remember when he came out in the beginning and his story really earned international headlines, really. He's one of the first whistleblowers, I think, who really received a lot of attention. Certainly not the first, but one of them. And I think over the years, he's been vindicated to a large degree. I do think he's telling the truth. I understand his story is controversial, but having talked to a number of contactees, quite a few of them have told me that the craft he describes is exactly the type of craft they've been on. I've had that come up a couple of times. And that's one of the reasons I think he's telling the truth. But there's a number of reasons. I'm following his story very closely. It's still developing. I know someone who's working with him. I can't really talk about it, but yeah, I understand he's still quite busy with all of this.
Okay, so he's back doing work related to this, because I understood after the biography that Jeremy Corbell did that he kind of got it out and he kind of was dragged back into it and he was done with it. But is he getting back into it now, I guess?
That's what I hear. I don't know any details whatsoever, but no, he doesn't do many interviews. He's really out of the limelight to a large degree.
Yes.
But I think he still follows it very closely. And I know someone, I just talked to James Goodall, who is good friends with him. And he says, oh, yeah, he's still active in this field and knows what's going on.
Very interesting. Now, I have been researching schoolyard UFOs, and I know you have a whole book on it. We've all heard about the Zimbabwe one that they talk about in the Phenomenon with James Fox, who I'm going to be interviewing in a couple days on here. What are some of the lesser known schoolyard UFO encounters?
Whew, there are a lot of them. I found out about this because of the Rua Zimbabwe case, which immediately brought to mind the Westall High School case in Melbourne, Australia in 1966. And then, of course, there's the Crestview Elementary School, which occurred in 1967, exactly 1 year to the day after the Melbourne High School case, both, of course, involving UFOs landing next to the school. There's another very famous case in Broadhaven, Wales, 1977. Again, a UFO landing, little ET guys coming out, students seeing them. We now know that some adults saw them as well. Those are the famous cases. But I found over 100. This was a real shock to me. I had interviewed a couple of people who'd had encounters themselves on playgrounds and such. But one, I think, little known case was at a Point, let me see what it's called, Point Elementary School, and I think that's the name of it, in Missouri. I interviewed the lady personally. Her name is Melody. She and a group of 5 other students were on the playground at the far end while everyone else was playing kickball next to the school when they saw this light through the trees. And they're little kids. They're thinking it's an ice cream truck. So they hop over, well, there wasn't a fence really, but the boundary to the school, and go walking through the trees there. And it's a craft. And standing in front of this craft is a little humanoid, not a gray. They said it looked quite different, very muscular, with almost a sort of an ape-like face is how she described it. And they were absolutely shocked. They stood up in a row watching this thing, who was only 10, 20 feet away, and staring at them eye to eye. And it slowly backed up into the craft. And as it was starting to board the craft, their teacher suddenly approached from behind, screamed bloody murder, obviously terrified. and grabbed them and pulled them back onto school grounds into their classroom. By this point, the whole playground had been alerted to this object because they could see it now too. And she pulled everyone into the classroom. The kids run to the window and they're watching it. And she's trying to close the blinds furiously. She's calling the principal. It was a big ordeal. They ended up ushering all the kids to the gymnasium and stopping school for the day. Some of the kids saw the craft actually take off. But that's one case that most people don't know about. But yeah, there's over 100 of these things. And they're amazing because there's really nothing like them in the literature. These are long-lasting, low-level sightings, and actually more than sightings. Get this, in 1/3 of the cases, it actually involves landings and or humanoids, which is pretty rare. Daylight sightings are rare, but landings are particularly rare. And another interesting fact is that half of these cases take place at elementary schools. Our youngest kids are actually great witnesses, I think, because they don't have, they don't discriminate. They don't have overlay what they're seeing with the belief system, like this is angels or demons or ETs. Many of them have never even heard of UFOs. They're excellent witnesses. They don't judge. So yeah, a lot of cases. And I will say over half do involve adult witnesses as well. There's one case I really like, which was in Maranui, New Zealand, because there were 400 kids on the playground and teachers when this object came floating over very slowly and hovered above the playground for a full 15 minutes. Absolutely stopped everyone dead on the playground, staring up at it, absolutely speechless, until finally it lifted up on its side and darted off at high speed. That's another pattern we see in a number of these cases. So there's a lot of them.
For the picture for the schoolyard UFO encounters, did you draw this?
I did not. I actually have the wonderful opportunity to have an artist in my family, my brother's wife.
Okay.
Sarah. I've worked with her from the beginning. She was there for me, and she'd sit next to me while I'm interviewing witnesses and draw what they were seeing, kind of like a police sketch artist. So we've worked together for a very long time, and she does the art for a lot of my books.
So would this picture be based on one of the cases you covered?
Not in particular. It's sort of an amalgam of a bunch of cases. But it's surprising how many cases do involve these UFOs landing right next to the school or ETs being seen. I just found out, I'm still finding new cases. Albert Rosales, I think it was him, who pointed me out to another case in South America, which was very much, I think it was Colombia, that's right, very much like the Rua Zimbabwe case, with ETs coming out and giving the children messages. And there's one case in Moline, Illinois, where there was a police officer on the playground. He happened to have a video camera in his cruiser. He ran and got it. And this is at Sacred Heart Elementary School in Moline, Illinois. And he was able to take about 30 seconds of footage of this object. Unfortunately, he caught it only as it was moving away. You can see the footage online. It shows a little glowing object. So by today's standard, it's not super impressive. But when you combine it with all the witnesses who were there, there were nuns who were watching this as well. It's a pretty impressive case. I think another favorite took place in Marysville at an elementary school where a number of UFOs showed up and they let down a huge volume of what we call angel hair, which is poorly understood, but it's kind of like a spider web or cotton candy type substance, which often disintegrates immediately upon touching the ground. But there was a lot of it. And in fact, it covered the entire school and about a mile radius around it. They actually were able to collect samples, which they sent off to Lockbourne Air Force Base. And as you might expect, never heard back from them. But the principal saw it. Another teacher saw it. A lot of students, of course, saw it, some 60 odd students. And there was another case very much like it in North Carolina just 1 year later. it's really interesting because there's this sort of pattern where this began around 1950, but every year there would be a high quality sighting. And it's kind of like a musician going from town to town playing their music, or an author doing a book tour. I think what's going on here, honestly, just judging from the cases themselves and the behavior of these craft and the ETs, is that they're putting on a really vigorous and well-organized publicity campaign to announce their presence. I'm just basing that on the cases. I have to tell you, when the Hillsdale College case took place, this takes place, elementary schools, junior high, high schools, and in colleges as well. But Hillsdale took place in March of 1966. And Jim and Cora Lorenzen, who were very prominent investigators at that time, remarked upon it and said, you know what, we've got a lot of these schoolyard cases. There's something going on here. And so did Raymond Fowler, also a very prominent researcher, best known for Betty Andreasen and the Allagash case. He said of the 15 cases he had that year, mind you, this is just March, 8 occurred over schools, over schoolyards. And they predicted more of these cases would be happening. And of course, it was 2 weeks later that the Westall High School case in Melbourne, Australia happened. So this is definitely a thing. This is absolutely very well verified. Cases all over the world, Russia, all across the African continent, Australia, China has some cases across South America, Canada, England, of course, all across Europe, really a lot in the United States as well.
Is it pretty much the same message as the Zimbabwe school got, where it was talking about you have to watch out for the environment and so forth, or was it different messages for the different schools all over the world?
In terms of actual communication, that's really rare. Most of these witnesses don't describe really much communication at all. I did interview one lady from Mentor, Ohio, who did get a message as this UFO came down, which basically said, remember this day. And it was repeated several times in her head to the point where she's like, this is not me saying this. The kids in the school in Columbia, which is not in the book, because I keep finding new cases, I'm going to have to put out a sequel or a new edition, because that one covers 100 cases, but I've got about 200 now, not kidding. This is how popular this is. But no, very few get messages, almost none. So it's really more of just ETs showing up over a school. I mean, there was one in Banchory, Scotland, came over this school, and it stayed 50 feet above the school for 10 minutes. Everyone on the playground saw it. Actually, school had just let out, so a bunch of teachers saw it as well. That's a really well-verified case, which was one of the earlier ones. But I've got cases all the way to like 2018, 2019. And I suspect, there's some ones after that as well.
So really, just before everyone started having the camera phones that could record videos like they have now, where if that happened now, where there's actual communication, it would pretty much 100% be recorded.
Yep. There are a few photographic cases. One I mentioned. There was another in.
Where would I find that Sacred Heart one? Do you know where it's posted? Because I don't see it on YouTube.
Gosh, it took me some digging to find it. It's in Moline, Illinois, Moline. If you type that in, Moline Sacred Heart Elementary School, it might come up. I did find it. It took me some digging. I know there's another case in, North Carolina, where a UFO kept showing up night after night. And one of the students was a photographer and finally just got a camera and was able to capture a time-lapse picture of this object as it moved across the sky, disappeared for a second, and reappeared, almost as if it was intentionally putting on a display. So there are some photographic cases. There's a number involving landing traces. Certainly the Westall High School case involved landing traces. A few involving physiological effects. or the kids will feel sort of a dizziness or some sort of static electricity as these objects come real low. It's amazing how many cases there are, but also it's in most cases very friendly, I guess would be the way of putting it, very benevolent. In a few cases, kids did freak out. There was one in Prestonburg, Kentucky in 1950, I believe it was, 54, thereabouts, where the whole playground absolutely panicked. I mean, one child was so frightened he started throwing up. The teacher ushered all the kids inside, and they went out later to play, and this UFO returned. So I think it's a very intentional display. You're outside, you might see a UFO fly by. That's not what's going on in these cases. They are coming from the horizon or way up high, coming down at a very low level, 100 feet, 200 feet. So it's very clearly targeting these schools and showing off. I mean, there was one by Ray Fowler where it came over a high school and came so low, one of the woman witnesses, she actually peed her pants. She thought it was going to crush her, but it went straight up and went over to the nearby college and put on a display over the college. So my point is, this is clearly intentional.
Now you're very much into the healing that we've seen from extraterrestrials and UFO related encounters. I've of course heard about those type of things, but I've also in recent years heard about cases like the Colares case where there's been some negative activity. Do you think that it's just different types of beings, or if some of it's confusing, they're confusing like aliens with maybe a black government project? Or what do you think it is where in some cases they heal people, where in other cases damage can be caused?
Yeah, I have done a lot of research on the healing. I'll just start with that because with 300 cases documented in that book, it's another one I need to do a sequel on. I already did, but it's close to double that now. And I can say with absolute certainty that healing is a big part of the contact experience, because pretty much every major researcher out there who focuses particularly on onboard cases or cases of direct contact has cases like these, even those who take a dim or negative view of the phenomena. I'll quote David Jacobs, who doesn't feel great about UFO contact, but has cases of people cured of diphtheria, pneumonia, and other illnesses. Bud Hopkins never wrote about it, but I cornered him at a convention and asked him directly, face to face. And he says, oh yeah, I do have many cases. Of course, John Mack does, Timothy Good, Phil Mantle, Barbara Lamb, Yvonne Smith, Tim Beckley, Brad Steiger, they all have cases. Edith Fiore. We can say with absolute certainty that this is a big part of ET contact. In the Ray Hernandez study, they found 50% of people have reported some kind of healing event during their contacts. And, writing this book, I, of course, did look into injury cases, which aren't quite as numerous and often appear to be accidental. Not always. Some people are struck by a beam of light and do suffer from it. I mean, there's one guy who was basically shooting at an ET, and it shot a ray of light back at him, and he ended up having what amounts to radiation sickness. But many of the cases that people often quote as injuries, I wonder about, like the Stefan Michalik case, where he basically ran up to a landed UFO and did get what appears to be radiation sickness. There are a number of cases like this. I know about the Colares case, and I wonder if this could possibly be, because some of the researchers who looked into this case, if this could possibly be black ops, covert government ops, MILABs, if you've heard that term, military abductions or military activity, because I do think we have this technology. And it's pretty clear to me our governments or secret governments are putting forth an ET threat narrative. There's a lot of talk about this, a false flag, fake ET invasion. It's possible this recent drone activity is sort of a dry run for this. I've got my opinions about that. But yeah, I mean, there are some injury cases, but they're not nearly as numerous as the healings, which I think really show the truth about what's going on here.
And what do you think about the implants?
Yeah, I've got several cases of people who have implants, and I've come to realize that probably most contactees, if not all, have these implants. Very early on in my research, I was talking to a lady who was pulled on board, and they told her, we're giving you an implant. And she asked them, what is it for? And they said, this is to measure the levels of pollution in your body. And that's when I started taking a closer look at them, because there's a lot of speculation out there that these are used for tracking. And I know of cases where people have asked that, and the ET said, no, we can find you whenever we want. And I think that's true, because I did talk to a lady who had her implant removed by Dr. Roger Lear, and very shortly later did have a repeat experience where they re-implanted her. But having talked to a number of people who've spoken to the ETs or had them give messages to them with, first-hand information rather than speculation, the ETs almost always say it's something along the lines of health, to monitor your health, to boost your immune system, to measure the levels of pollution in your body, to regulate your health in some way. There was one lady I interviewed who sneezed out an implant, and she tried to recover it, was not able to. But at any rate, she became very ill shortly following this with a hypoglycemia type illness, ended up losing a lot of weight, became very skinny. Doctors were incredibly concerned. They could not diagnose her. They couldn't figure out what was going on, but she was fainting several times a day. Her blood sugar was going up and down wildly. It wasn't diabetes. They couldn't figure it out. And she was pulled on board or into what could have been a base. She's really not sure. It was a very large room, and there was a lot of people there, and she was confronted by, she says, a 9-foot tall humanoid being, which was certainly not a gray or a reptilian or mantis or anything, just a strange humanoid with spiky orange hair, she said, wearing a shiny black jumpsuit, who took these shiny silver bell-like instruments and placed them on various locations over her pancreas, her adrenal glands, and so forth, and pulsed energy into her body, which she says was distinctly uncomfortable, not painful, but really scary. And in fact, she started screaming because he turned to her and laid her down and said, it's your turn, Jill. That's not her name. I use a pseudonym. But that's all she really remembers, except waking up the next day very sore. And she says over the next few weeks, from that day on, she stopped fainting every day. She was painful for a week, but her health stabilized almost immediately. She's absolutely convinced they healed her. So yeah, I can't say many different types of conditions are also healed. Everything from minor colds and flus to broken fingers or bones or bruises or backaches, liver and kidney disease, serious illnesses of all kinds, from diabetes to hepatitis, diphtheria. I've got 20 or 30 cases involving eyes, some of the teeth as well, many involving tumors or cysts, 30 plus involving cancer. So these represent really good evidence, and many of them have been well verified by doctors.
We've heard Lou Elizondo say in his book Imminent, which I'm sure you probably read, about the implant that moved around and tried to evade getting cutouts in the one case he was involved with. Is that a common thing where the implant will appear to actually be a living organism to some extent?
Yeah, it's really an enigma, because I'm not sure I would call it common, but it's certainly consistent. And I know a lady, Dolly Safran, who's experienced this. She's my favorite contactee. I wrote a full-length book about her, Symmetry. She's had that happen. I interviewed a lady from Indiana who took her son to the dentist, and they did the x-rays and found this almost marble-sized foreign body under his back molar. And they asked him, did you shoot yourself in the mouth with a BB gun? Which, of course, he denied. She denied. There's no entry wound. The tooth is asymptomatic. She sent me the x-rays. I sent them to 2 doctors, both of who are UFO researchers, one a MUFON field investigator, and one's an emergency physician, one's a general physician. Both said the same thing. It's a metallic foreign body. But they went back to the dentist a year later and took an x-ray. It was there. He took a second x-ray. It was gone. This upset one of the dental assistants so badly, she had to leave the office. But they took a third x-ray and it was back again. Because, this wasn't a defect in the machine. It worked all day. It was working before and after. Yeah, they can move around. Dr. Roger Lear talked about this as well. So these are very, very advanced technology. Dolly Saffron, she talked about how she dug one out of her nasal cavity once. She's a nurse, and watched it dissolve in her hand. A number of cases of that happening as well. So this is one of the reasons it's very hard to get a hold of these things. I'm glad Dr. Roger Lear did his work. I've spoken to him many times about it before he passed on, and to his clients as well. There's a lot of really interesting properties about them that make it clear they're very unusual. I consider them the smoking gun evidence that really proves the reality of ET intervention. I'm not sure that skeptics would agree, but I think if anyone who takes an objective look at it can only come away convinced that there's something really profound going on here.
Michael's bringing up the quote unquote UFO wave with the drones and the orbs. It's questionable whether some of the drones, I think, are actually government vehicles or not, and civilian vehicles. But what do you know about the more orb-like things?
Yeah, I've gotten some pushback on this. It's my assessment that what we're dealing with here is covert military ops, just based on my own research, watching this whole thing develop. Got a number of reasons for feeling this way, just based on what the videos I'm seeing, the ones that I feel are trustworthy. Yeah, some of these are clearly drones as we would think of it. Some do look more like orbs. And this is where I get some of the pushback. But I can tell you that our own government does have technology that is retrieved from ET or reverse engineered from ET tech and would look and act very much like a regular UFO. Not to mention technology with holograms, or very much like we've seen on billboards with cars or people or animals or whales coming out of billboards or out of gymnasium floors and looking entirely real. So this would be very easy for them to do. And one of the reasons I'm really suspicious about this is because of the timing, for one thing. We're having a lot of congressional hearings, a lot of talk, a lot of pushback on the Pentagon for answers about the UFO subject in general. And that's when we have this huge wave of sightings. I'm also very suspicious about how our government is reacting to this, with the CIA and the Pentagon and releasing statements and backpedaling and being conflicting in their reports about what they think this is or not is. I also find the media coverage in general very suspicious, because it's a rare UFO event that gets any media coverage at all. And yet this one is a frenzy of coverage. It's deliberately being covered and was for quite some time. Michael Kennedy says it's still going on. Yeah, I've heard about just a recent case in Europe, which I believe occurred today or yesterday. So the coverage, I'm not sure, is accurately reflecting the actual levels of activity. And I know there are some people out there who are absolutely convinced this is ET. But I have to tell you, personally, having investigated a number of UFO waves, they almost always involve people being pulled on board as well. You get a huge spike in reports of people seeing ETs face to face, getting messages of all kinds, being pulled on board. And I'm not seeing any of that as well. I'm also curious about the timing of, our shifting government in terms of a new administration. So I'm watching it closely. I will say for me, what really put the nail in the coffin, this being government ops, is talking to contactees. And I'm going to bring up Dolly Saffron again. She's kind of my go-to gal for this because she's in telepathic contact still to this day with her ET contacts. And they said, no, this is not us. This is your military. I'm very concerned that this might be a dry run for the, Project Bluebeam quote, a fake ET invasion. I don't know. I'm watching the situation closely. I'm very concerned about it. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation. I wish we could trust more of the footage we're seeing, but a lot of it out there is clearly CGI. That's a real problem. But apparently some of these objects have crashed and they're drones as we would think of them. And of course, there's all kinds of theories of these being hobbyists. I think we can discard that. Now, foreign government, that's entirely possible. I think it's more likely our own government, which is heavily compartmentalized. And just because you're a governor or a senator or a representative or even the president doesn't mean that you would be in the loop to what's going on here. Because it's really the highest levels of the military and the intelligence agencies who are behind the cover-up. And I suspect responsible for this activity.
And the lack of response for so long is another sign that it could have been us, because if it was foreign or something truly unknown, I don't think they would just be letting it happen for as long as it happened for.
Yeah. And I wish we could trust the Pentagon or, the CIA or the FBI or the NSA, but we can't. And this is demonstrable. They've lied for 80 plus years. So they're really not a credible source of information when it comes to this. And I hate to say it, but it's their own darn fault. They've dug their own grave. I think this is why we're seeing disclosure, because our governments want to remain credible, relevant, control the narrative. But they're at the point now where they're not a credible source. So it's a sticky situation. I'm really interested to see how this all rolls out. I suspect it'll fade away like so many other stories, and we won't hear anything about it, but maybe not. Maybe this will escalate and we'll get some real answers. I honestly don't think our governments are ever going to be fully truthful and transparent with this subject. Certainly not voluntarily. I do suspect this year we will get some major statements from higher and higher levels of government that this is a real phenomenon, meaning UFOs. We might get little pieces of metal perhaps, or some really good footage. But are they going to show us that film where the UFO landed at Edwards Air Force Base that astronaut Gordon Cooper saw the footage of? I doubt it. Are we going to, until our governments, our intelligence agencies are willing to admit to the truth of Roswell or the Malmstrom incident of 1967 or the Eisenhower meeting in 1954 at Edwards Air Force Base or the flyover of the Washington Capitol in 1952, I don't think I can trust them. They have to start being more truthful and transparent. Until they can admit to the truth of that, then maybe I'll listen. Till then, I don't really want to hear it because I don't trust a thing they say.
What is this Eisenhower thing? I've heard rumblings about it, but I've never actually heard the full story on this alleged meeting.
Yeah, that's another thing I don't think we'll ever hear the full story about. I started diving deeper into it when I wrote UFOs over California and started getting a lot of cases of UFOs over Edwards Air Force Base. Very well verified incidents of these objects hovering over the base all the way back to 1947. Very well verified cases of them appearing on radar. Credible reports of crash retrievals and reverse engineering going on there. I've got my own witnesses, a few who actually provided first-hand interviews for me about this. But the Eisenhower meeting occurred in February of 1954 when Eisenhower disappeared from the media, who, speculation ran wild. One even reported that he had died of a heart attack, which wasn't true. A cover story apparently was put out that he had an emergency dental visit, but researchers tracked that down and basically debunked that. And the more research that's been done on this by an army of researchers really have looked into this. And the vast majority of them have come away convinced that there was a meeting with Eisenhower and many high-level officials within science, government, business, even some UFO researchers. Gerald Light, I believe, was one of them. But supposedly some really high-level people in rocketry and so forth were there. And UFOs came down and landed, put on a display. Reportedly, Eisenhower and others were taken on board. The ET showed how they could turn their craft transparent. And there was sort of an impasse because the reason for this meeting was twofold on the part of the ETs. They wanted us to disclose the ET presence and stop messing around with nuclear weapons, whereas we did not want to do either of those. And we wanted ET tech, which they said no. And there's what I consider to be disinformation being inserted in this story, that there was some sort of agreement reached where we allowed ETs to take people on board in exchange for technology, a treaty of sorts, which I don't believe is true. Dolly Saffron actually asked her ET contacts about that, and they said, no, we would never give technology to a government that has a long, heinous history of abusing any technology and using it for ill purposes. So there's disinformation that has been inserted into this story, but I do believe it did happen. I think the reporting on it is just getting better and better as time goes on.
And President Jimmy Carter, who just passed away, saw a UFO. Is that correct at one point?
Yes, I believe this was right before he was governor. Kudos to him for coming forward, because Dennis Kucinich talked about seeing a UFO while he was running his nomination for president, and it basically killed his chances. But Carter survived it. He was with a group of people outside, I think it was the Lions Club, 7 or 8 of them, 12, saw this brilliant object low on the horizon, flaring up, colorful lights, finally moving off. There have been debunkers who have tried to explain this. First as Venus, that didn't pan out. Others have tried to explain it as a barium cloud or from a rocket launch or something along those lines, which Carter himself denied. He was very much impressed by it. He submitted his sighting to UFO organizations and has always been very upfront about it. And in fact, said he would do his best to get this subject treated with more truth and transparency, but then clamp down on it. There's all sorts of rumors that he was pretty shocked to find out what's going on behind the scenes. We never did hear the full story. But yeah, kudos to him for stepping forward. Very few politicians have. A few have. Senator Russell from, I think, Virginia did. Governor Gilligan from Ohio went forward with his sighting. Ronald Reagan, when he was governor, had a sighting. Quite a few heads of state. The president of Mexico had a sighting. There was a president of a republic in the Russia area, Ilyamanov, I think was his name, who said he was fully taken on board and had conversations with human-looking ETs. So there are some heads of state who've absolutely come forward and talked about this. But here in the U.S., or anywhere in the world, we have yet to have a sitting head of state admit to the reality of UFOs.
It seems like President Trump is probably going to possibly admit to the reality of non-human intelligence. According to a lot of people are saying that it could happen within like the next 4 months. What have you heard about this?
Yeah, I've heard the same rumors. You can, he's mentioned it several times, and he's always been very much on the fence about it, saying he's not himself sure, but has talked to people who he finds quite credible, which is sort of, again, being on the fence about it. It's not that hard. Just say, that you believe it or don't. So I'm hoping he will. He is a bit of a maverick. He's definitely shaking things up. I think if anyone has the potential to do it, it would be him, because the time is right. it's now reached a point where we have enough evidence to prove this phenomena in the public arena. I mean, if you look at the worldwide databases, not just MUFON, Mutual UFO Network, and NUFORC, the National UFO Reporting Center, which have some 300,000 documented cases. But we have APRO, we have NICAP, we have QFOS. This is just in the United States. There's organizations like this in most of the major countries: Japan, China, England, France, Brazil, Mexico. They all have UFO reporting agencies. So we've got a documented worldwide database of well over 1 million accounts. So we have enough evidence to prove this unequivocally, that we are being visited. So I think to deny the truth of it, you become not credible. So I think we do have a really good chance of someone, if not the US, a major country. And if all it takes is one, and then there's kind of a domino effect. I respect Steve Bassett for the work he's doing, trying to push this forward. Stephen Greer as well. There's been a number of researchers who've worked real hard to get some movement. And I am so excited about it because I've been in this field for decades and not one word from officials for 20, 30, 40 years. But now we're getting something starting in 2016 onwards. There's been real movement.
Yes, as well as 3 congressional hearings and 1 Senate hearing recently. So, I mean, and there's a UAP task force. So, I mean, people can't really deny anymore that there's at least UAPs with all these hearings and AARO. What do you think about Arrow recent findings on the gimbal, saying that they've debunked the gimbal?
I don't trust them. Some of this technology may very well be ours. I will say that, especially these days. But Arrow they're considered, I think, a joke by most UFO researchers. It's funny because they have 6 major goals, and the first 3 I think are pretty reasonable, which is basically surveying activity, mapping it, determining their capabilities. But the other 3 goals, the last 3, kind of raised my eyebrows. One is governing UFO activity, like trying to control it, obtaining ET tech. So I don't think we're ever going to be able to basically control the UFOs. They're going to do what they want. Their technology is far, far superior to our own. But I don't find Arrow to be a credible source, nor NASA, who recently formed a panel and a committee saying, oh, we're going to look into this now. Oh, really, now, after 80 years? And they said, well, we still need more information to determine what's going on. I'm like, pick up a UFO book. There's enough information. Anyone who's new to this field can literally take 1 day to look at some of the evidence and only come away convinced. I'm always amazed when people come at me who are skeptical and saying, there's no proof. I'm like, yes, there is. We have not only 1 million documented cases, but there's radar return cases. There's landing trace cases. We have implant removals. The studies of angel hair, which I mentioned earlier, are really interesting because this is hard physical evidence. There's an enormous amount of evidence. The healing cases alone, I think, are really persuasive.
Do you think that Mike Gold guy that testified at the last congressional hearing, who used to work with NASA, was telling the truth as far as NASA UFO knowledge? Because Paul Hellyer, the former Canadian Minister of Defense, who I interviewed before he passed, was saying there's no way that NASA doesn't know a lot about what's actually going on with all of their satellites up there.
Yeah, we know a satellite can read a postage stamp. We know there's 100,000 satellites up there. It's absolutely disingenuous. Of course they know what's going on. They're tracking this very carefully. NASA has never been super respected by the press, who kind of joked around that NASA stands for never a straight answer because of so many conflicting reports they're giving. I was not impressed by Mr. Gold's testimony whatsoever. especially when he said, we don't know what these are. They could be China. I'm like, really? I wasn't really impressed with anyone on the panel when they were asked directly, what are UFOs? And all of them kind of acted like a 5-year-old and said, I don't know. I like what Tim Gallaudet had to say, that he really pushed for strong action, not just talk. He wanted some real action taken. So kudos to him for that. And I think Lou Elizondo is in a tough position because he does have NDAs imposed upon him. I suspect he knows more than he can say. I suspect he's probably being used to a certain extent. I can only speculate about that. I have to give kudos to anybody who enters this field. But I'm also very wary of anyone who comes from the intelligence sector and starts talking about the subject just because their record on this is so bad. But yeah, whistleblowers, there's so many of them. I'm really pleased to see all these people coming out now and talking about this. And I think what's really interesting about that is that a lot of them aren't being prosecuted, because if our governments were to prosecute these people for releasing information or go after them, all it really would do is verify their story. Because if there's nothing to it, why do you care?
Very true. And there's a lot. I haven't really done much research into Bigfoot, but I know you have several books on the Sasquatch phenomena, and there is a connection to UFOs with Bigfoot, a lot of people say. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there absolutely is. It's tenuous, but it's absolutely undeniable, because I did look into Bigfoot reluctantly, I have to say. I had a sneaking suspicion it might be real, but had to follow the research where it takes you. You can't basically ignore evidence and expect to solve any mysteries. And I did get a Bigfoot UFO case up in Canyon Country, where a gentleman had a UFO land in his backyard, and the very next night had a profound Bigfoot encounter, which he felt was absolutely related. And I soon got other cases. So I started looking into it and did Bigfoot research solely as well, and found, of course, Bigfoot is real. It's all over the world. The accounts reach back several hundred years. There's no doubt about it. The evidence is very much conclusive. It's not just eyewitness reports. There's sound recordings, there's films, there's footprints, hair samples, many reports of bodies, actually, but they're often scooped up and you can track them. They usually disappear towards the Smithsonian or some other government research facility scooping them up. Most people who see a Bigfoot aren't going to see a UFO. It would be like less than 1%, statistically insignificant. And the same, of course, is true for UFOs. If you see a UFO, you're probably not going to see a Bigfoot. But here's the thing. We're left with a smattering of cases, a good 100 or 200, where these two phenomena coincide perfectly. Several occurred in Pennsylvania and were revealed by the great research of Stan Gordon. But, many researchers have cases like these. And it's very curious and hard to figure out, because people are speculating, is Bigfoot an ET? Because there's some cases where Bigfoot has been seen going on board a craft or coming out. Some pretty credible reports of UFOs appearing and a Bigfoot, coming at people right while the UFO is there. So there is a connection. My current assessment is that what we're looking at is, Bigfoot are not extraterrestrials. I think the reports go so far back, we can say that they've been here for a long time, are likely sentient, as we would think of it, do have what we would call psychic abilities that are quite advanced, even with telepathy, because that comes up quite a bit in firsthand reports, but even things like interdimensional activity in terms of them disappearing or something like this, or turning invisible. I've got a few of my own firsthand cases of this. So I think what we're looking at is that some Bigfoot are what we would consider to be UFO contactees. Oh, I cringe when I think what skeptics might think of this. Like, what? What are you talking about? But we're kind of stuck with these reports. And the fact is, there are enough of them that we can say definitively that there is a connection. So I think that's probably what's going on here, that some Bigfoot are being contacted by ETs, much in the same way humans are. And we do know ETs are interested in all forms of life on this planet because they've been seen collecting soil samples. They've been seen collecting rocks and leaves and twigs and flowers, rabbits, animals of all kinds. I mean, you name it. ETs have come down and scooped up samples, including, human genetic samples. So I think they're basically trying to preserve life on this planet. This is what they've told people. They're very concerned about how we're treating this planet, ourselves, each other. That's a message most contactees will get at some point. So yeah, that's my current assessment of what's going on with the ET Bigfoot connection.
What are the main states where Bigfoot are seen in the U.S.?
The West has got an enormous number of cases. California, Oregon, and Washington lead by far in terms of the number of reports. But every single state in the United States has cases. There's a few even in England. Canada has got an enormous number of reports as well. But they're, of course, not as heavily populated. So I think per capita, California has the most, though others might argue that Washington is right there as well. Florida has quite a few. Georgia, I live now in the Blue Ridge Mountains of northern Georgia, and there's this Bigfoot museum not too far away. I went there, of course, and looked at the map where they had put little dots of where all the sightings were. Quite a few around here as well. They're everywhere. Of course, many different types as well. In California, they're generally much taller than you might see in other countries or other states even. They all go by different names, whether it's Sasquatch or Bigfoot or skunk ape or, all the countries, of course, have their own names for them. And some look very much human-like. I mean, we tend to think of Bigfoot as being completely covered in hair and very ape-like. But some of the descriptions sound much more like almost Neanderthal or wild man, which sounds crazy because you'd think, our world is fully explored. It's not. Most of the human population is clustered along shorelines, rivers, and lakes and cities. There's vast, vast, vast tracts of wilderness out there that, people may have walked through, but still are largely desolate. Absolutely possible for large populations of Bigfoot to remain undetected. And if they're intelligent and interdimensional, that would also explain why we don't have really powerful evidence in the public arena in terms of a Bigfoot body that we can all examine.
Interesting. As far as the different types of aliens, I know we've discussed this before, but looking at all the covers of your books, are you doing these based on various types of extraterrestrials that have been described to you as far as these covers? Because some of these look pretty interesting, but there seems to be some common features of all of them too.
Yeah, these are all actual firsthand witness cases. The most popular in my own files, certainly, and I think this is borne out by other researchers, is grays, as we would think of them, varying in height from 3 feet to 5 feet generally, but 6 feet, 7, even 8 feet, and many variations of grays, because it's not always, gray skin. Some describe it as more tan or pale white or even bluish or slightly greenish, or you name it. So there's quite a variation of grays alone. Next to that, I think, would be human looking figures that are described being very much like us, though perhaps a little bit more genetically perfect, but certainly all skin tones. It's not just Nordic, so I don't like that term because that's misleading. They're not all Caucasian. There are people who, one gentleman I interviewed said he looked Iranian to him. Dark skin, dark hair, dark eyes, very handsome. Another gentleman I interviewed said that the human-looking figures he saw looked Mesoamerican, perhaps Mexican or Peruvian, 5 feet tall, all looked very much identical or very similar in appearance. So human-looking would be second. Praying mantis is another fairly common type. I don't have a whole lot of cases, but definitely quite a number of them. Short little humanoids of all kinds, tall whites as well, which look very much like us, but paler skin, very thin, very white, thin hair or blonde. Uh, there are, of course, reptilian. I think those might be, honestly, better described as crypto-terrestrials, because most of the cases I have don't involve UFOs at all. It's people walking around in the wilderness who encounter them. But what we're seeing almost without exception is the humanoid form. And if you talk to contactees, and I think this is where you're going to get the best information, not from governments, but from people who've had direct contact, most of them at some point will get the message, we are you, you are us. We are one. We share a common heritage. We have a common ancestry. So in a way, I think what we're looking at is we're all humanoids. We all share genetics. It just dials out differently in our terms of ancestry. And if you look here on Earth, you can see an amazing variation of ancestry with tiny little people and very tall people, 7 feet tall, all the way down to 3 or 4 feet tall, with every skin tone, eye shape, nose shape, lips, you name it, that you could probably stick a gray and all other different types of ETs in there, and they would not be noticed very quickly because there's such variation here on this planet. So I think we have to stop thinking of them as alien or other, because what contactees are being told is that we all share a common heritage. And it's a mistake to think of them as absolutely different species, because apparently we all are very much more alike than different.
For the crypto terrestrials, you mentioned the reptilians could be crypto terrestrials. Could some of them be from underwater? And we've also heard that maybe some of them are actually from underground.
I would lean more towards the underground theory. At this point, we don't really know. This is still a relatively new field of study. While people have been looking into this for some decades, we don't know. I mean, there's still a lot of mysteries and questions surrounding what's going on here. Yeah, I think it's possible that they're from underground. I don't know that they're from under the ocean. I think there's some really good evidence of USOs and craft going in and out of the water. We know they're, can travel in any medium, whether it's a vacuum, outer space, our atmosphere, in the water, or even them going directly through solid objects. Because there are many cases of UFOs going into the ground and not exploding or anything, but the ground looks like it's opening up.
Yeah, and even going through walls. And I know this is crazy for a lot of people, and I, in some ways, think it is too. But I've heard like very credible people discuss cases where this has happened recently.
Yeah, one guy I talked to from upstate New York basically was in his bed when the room kind of transformed into a UFO. And I kind of thought, well, he's just misperceiving here. He was pulled on board somehow. But no, they will sometimes. I've heard other cases where they can actually come through sort of interdimensionally into a person's house and scoop them up, and off they go, moving through the walls itself. So yeah, I think there's something to that. It's incredible when you think about it. But I remember Jacques Vallée had a case where an object was moving right through trees, right through a forest, what appeared to be a solid object. So a number of cases like that, which I think we're only starting to really begin to understand what's going on here. Again, I am a believer we're dealing with extraterrestrials. That's my assessment. I did have my own fully conscious onboard experience not too long ago. I've had a number of sightings.
That must have been since the last time I talked to you, because I believe the last time I talked to you, you still hadn't had anything like that. So maybe you could share that.
Yeah, that occurred in 2022 on my birthday, by the way.
Okay.
Birthday present. And I've known for a while that the ETs are aware of me because they've certainly showed up during some CE5 things. I've had a few people tell me, that they were referred to me by the ETs. That's happened at least 3 times, which the first time I took with a grain of salt. The second time I'm like, wow. And the third time I'm like, okay, there's something to this, which makes sense because I think they watch over contactees certainly very closely. It isn't my family, I will say. I did have a missing time encounter as a young man in 1992 in late July, where a little orb came down in front of my car, and that's really all I remember. And I've had some real close-up sightings and some communication even. But on May 6th, 2022, I was pulled out of my bed up this energy beam. And I recognized the feeling. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is happening. I kind of had a weird recall of this happening before, which I hadn't remembered until it actually happened again. And it took a good 30 seconds, and I found myself lying on a table being examined by someone who was not human. She looked largely human. I would call her probably a hybrid. She was very tall, 6 feet tall, very slender, wearing a shiny white jumpsuit, had big wraparound eyes, tight, thin, curly blonde hair. Attractive, certainly, but not fully human by any means. I don't think she could pass here on this planet because her eyes were so large and her nose was so tiny and a very, very thin mouth, but very friendly and was kind of holding me down, asking me if I'm all right. I wanted to get up. I was ready to explore. And she's like, no, you need to stay down. We need to make sure you're okay. And it took some convincing to let them know that I was okay. There were short little guys around me. I didn't really look at them because I was sort of really focused on her face, which was different, but by no means scary in any way. Finally, they let me off the table. I could see I was in a big, round, grayish silver room with smooth floors, well lit, windows all the way around, probably 40 feet across or so. And I immediately was drawn to a tall gray who was fully ET, a huge head, probably 7.5 feet tall. I mean, I'm 5'9 3/4, and I had to look up at her, and she had to look down at me. It was a lady. I got that impression very strongly. Didn't really look so much at her body, which was covered by a white smock, but I could see her limbs were very long and very thin, and she had giant wraparound eyes, tiny little mouth, which was curled up in a little smile, tiny little nubbin nose, and she tilted her head and looked down at me. Very loving, very graceful, extremely elegant, incredibly wise, and said to me telepathically, so, is this what you thought it would be like? And I said, no, this is much better, because just the feeling of being on there, having talked to so many people, I always wondered what it was like. And it was amazing. I mean, the feeling of goodwill and love, actually, just to put it simply, was almost overwhelming. It was great. It was clear to me these people were very spiritually, psychically, ethically, morally advanced. And I could see other people there. I saw grays. I went to the window, looked down on the earth, which was covering most of the field of vision below me. So I don't know how many miles up, but I don't know, 50 or 100 or more. And the ship dropped down right to the ground level and rocked slightly. It was so cool. Rose back up. At some point, they gave me a little drink of green liquid, which was apparently medicinal to protect against radiation, because you are there in space where there's gamma radiation. All in all, it was about a 5-minute long encounter, but absolutely wonderful from beginning to end. After they gave me that drink, I basically woke up in bed, and I'm like, wow, that happened. That actually happened. It was amazing.
Did they extract sexual fluid? I gotta ask.
I have no memory of that. No.
Someone was wondering, why would they need to wear clothes?
Well, why do we need to wear clothes? I mean, the fact is they do. in most cases. Some people do report them not wearing clothes. I suspect in most cases what people are looking at is a very tight jumpsuit because people aren't seeing, all the bodily organs which are there according to the contactees I've spoken to. And some of the contactees I've spoken to say that they don't wear clothes when on board. Some say do, but by and large, jumpsuits are very popular. Smocks are next. When they're on Earth, many people describe divers' suits or helmets and things like this. So that's another area that definitely could use some more research. But yeah, I think they wear clothes for pretty much the same reason we do, when outside of their craft for protection. But I don't think it's so much a sense of design and fashion. It's more utilitarian.
And just as we wrap it up here, to talk about, like, in a lot of these cases, they do seem to extract sexual fluid. Do you think this is for some type of hybrid program? And also with a lot of these mutilation cases, which some, I guess, are black programs, according to George Knapp, they're also extracting like sexual organs and stuff from animals. So are they potentially doing something where they're reproducing humans and animals elsewhere, or sending different versions of hybrids back to Earth?
Yeah, well, I'll start with the mutilations. It's my assessment, having written UFOs over New Mexico and Colorado, I did look into the cattle mutilations and started, surveying the major researchers in this area. Ultimately, I feel like this is government. I don't think the ETs do this. I asked Dolly Saffron about it, and she's vehement about it. No, ETs are not the ones who are mutilating the cattle. This is part of a scare campaign and genetic research on the part of our own governments. My assessment, as far as a hybrid program, yeah, absolutely. They are taking genetic material from men and women and creating what we would think of as hybrids. But again, I think we have to be very careful here because essentially, and I've been told this myself by the ETs, that the Greys are human, that they actually looked like us at one point, but have suffered, genetic damage or genetic evolution, ancestry that made them look this way. I know of other cases of that too. So calling them hybrids might be a little bit misleading, but they are absolutely reinvigorating their own genetic stock with our own. And I think as far as us, I can tell you a number of contactees do believe they are what we would call hybrids. And I've got some really good evidence of this as well. So I think we have major questions about human origins in general, especially given the fact that some of these ETs look just like us. That raises serious questions about who we are. Did we evolve on this planet? How close is our relationship to ETs? So yeah, I think there's some truth to it. Do I think ETs are going to come down and take over our planet with a hybrid race? No, I don't think that's even in the realm of possibility. But it's clear to me that they are collecting genetics from all life on this planet and preserving it from extinction, because we are on a road to self-extinction with, the way we're using nuclear weapons and polluting our planet, and frankly, all the war and aggression. So we will probably end up extinguishing ourselves if we continue down this pathway of self-destruction. And I think that's what's going on here. That's why they're pulling genetic material. It's nothing nefarious. It's certainly a two-way street, helping them as well as us. I think that's why people are being pulled on board, is to protect our own genetics, which are being polluted by gamma radiation, or just, damaged by gamma radiation, but also polluted by contaminants that we're putting in our own food. So there's a lot going on here that we need to take a careful, objective, not fear-based look at.
And we have also heard the other theory that it's not necessarily clones coming from somewhere else, or hybrids coming from somewhere else, that the hybrids could already be among us within the population. And I'm not saying that they could necessarily be nefarious, but there have been some credible people that have talked about that type of thing over the years.
Yeah. Oh, there are definitely people who've seen ETs in places you would never in a million years expect. Gas stations, casinos, convenience stores, schools. I mean, you name it, restaurants, uh, subways. And definitely, I think some of them do look like us. So it would be perfectly logical and reasonable to expect that they're walking among us to some degree. So that doesn't surprise me one bit. I'd be surprised if that wasn't happening.
That's a massive dog you have back there.
Yeah, she's a horse. She weighs as much as I do. Come say hi, Duchess. She's a Great Dane.
Oh, wow. You don't have to worry about burglars.
No,
Now, what was she there for the alien abduction?
no, she wasn't. It's funny. I was living in Reseda at that time, which is very densely populated. I mean, there's quite literally 2 million people within a 30-mile radius. But I have to tell you, just down the street was a lady I know whose daughter was taken from her home, also in Reseda. And I know another case in Reseda involving a gentleman who was taken from his home. That case was investigated by Ann Druffel and D. Scott Rogo. A lot of cases everywhere. ETs have no problem coming down and taking people that they have interest in. Certainly within my family, I can tell you that my little sister had a missing time encounter. My brother, he's the one who got me into this field, had a very close-up encounter, and at one point found what appeared to be an implant in his arm that eventually disappeared. I took him to a doctor and UFO researcher to have him check it out. And the doctor was like, oh my God, we need to get this x-rays right away. This is clearly a foreign body, because you could palpate it. It was on the inside of his elbow, like a half matchstick that you could actually kind of poke up and feel. No entry wound, nothing. It is in my family. I'm quite certain of it. I've got 2 nephews who got encounters, two sister-in-laws. One of my nephews saw humanoids come into his bedroom. So yeah, they do seem to track certain family genetic lines. But the more I talk to contactees, they say pretty much everyone on this planet is known by them, has had some level of contact, and has been given the opportunity to interact with them to some degree. A lot of people simply are not aware of it. They're just, it's going right over their heads. They're in denial or just not aware of it at all.
Now, for a while, I don't know if you've heard about this, but for a good 4 to 6 months, I was having almost nightly nightmares about aliens that were very, very realistic, and a lot of them, they were those type of paralyzing nightmares where you can't move. And some of the times they were so realistic, I'd actually have to turn the light on and kind of get my wits about me when I woke up. Is that something you hear about often amongst researchers of this subject?
Yeah, to some degree. I would have to ask more questions about this, because there is something called sleep paralysis, because your body secretes a chemical which prevents you from acting out your dreams. And this can be very lifelike and quite frightening for people. It's not ET, though some researchers, debunkers, I should say, have tried to explain away all onboard cases as being caused by sleep paralysis, which is absurd, ridiculous, doesn't come close, doesn't explain the healing cases or landing traces or multiple sightings or, multi-witness onboard cases. But I can say that some people do have what amounts to a dream memory of a real event. So they'll be pulled on board, have a full-on conscious encounter, but come back feeling like this was a dream. And this is in some ways facilitated by the ETs, whose goal is not to frighten people. So if someone has a panic reaction, they might come back from a full physical experience with the perception that this was a dream. Or conversely, it might be a real experience that happened prior that was suppressed and is now coming out in the dream state, because this is how we do process events that are difficult for us to process. They will come out later in dreams. And like Betty Hill is a good example. She had missing time, and in the weeks that followed, she dreamt about being taken on board, and it was frightening for her. She wrote these dreams down, later went under hypnosis, of course, and her dream recall and her hypnotic recall meshed almost perfectly. It's a good way to recall what happened during missing time. I usually recommend doing what I would call dream work prior to doing hypnotic regression. So it could be a dream recall of a real event, or a real event that's being recalled immediately as a dream, or just a sleep paralysis type of thing going on. I'd have to ask a lot more questions, because most contactees will have a history of encounters. So I have a whole list of like 20 or 30 questions, like, have you had weird childhood incidents, visitations? Is there a history of UFO encounters in your family? Have you ever had a close-up UFO sighting within a couple of 100 feet? Have you ever had any unexplained healings or marks on your body? There's a whole list of questions. Fear of intruders, insomnia, any sinus problems or unexplained nosebleeds. All kinds of questions I would ask to determine if something like a sleep paralysis dream could in fact be UFO related.
The good news is, since I've been here in Wichita from Canada, I haven't had any of that happen. So I'm glad that that's over with. As far as the nightmarish ones, which is strange, because as nightmarish as they were, I was still interested to see if they were going to happen again from a scientific perspective. But just a couple more fan questions here before we wrap it up, because I've heard this one numerous times. Someone on here is asking, do they take women's babies early in pregnancy, as far as in some cases of abductions?
Yeah, I prefer not to use the term abduction, because I've gotten in trouble with some contactees or experiencers who don't like that term. This does turn up. I did have a very early case involving what we would term a missing fetus or a missing pregnancy. And over the years, I've run into a number of cases of this. I'm not going to call it super common, but it's certainly consistent. I mean, I talked to one couple from Canada, the Nova Scotia area, she was pregnant all the way up to 7.5 months, had an encounter, and then was not pregnant. And she absolutely sent me, verification with photographs and reports from her midwife and so forth. And later saw her baby on board, was okay with it. Dolly Saffron had this experience where she had a pregnancy, and they asked her actually if she would agree to this, and she did. I talked to another lady from Michigan who had this experience, and she's okay with it as well. One lady in California I talked to had this experience, and she felt it was kind of a violation, which, hey, I totally understand. But she did come from a place of confusion, not understanding what was going on, did not recall giving permission. So this is a very controversial aspect, but absolutely, yes, this does happen. There's quite a few cases of it. I think enough of them to say that for sure, yeah, this does go on.
Yes, I've definitely heard of a bunch. This is kind of an out there question, but let's get your opinion on this. Fan wants to know, is there a God?
Well, we all want to know that, don't we? I mean, I'm not a particularly religious person, but having had a lot of out-of-body experiences, I've gone to the light as described by near-death experiences, what we would call source, and certainly feels like God to me. I kind of look at the entire universe as God. A number of contactees have asked this. And one guy, Walter Rizzi, I think was his name, from Italy, had an encounter, and he asked the ETs that. And he's like, what, is God real? And they said, yes, you are God. We are God. Everything around us is what you would consider God. That comes up in a number of cases. Dolly Saffron asked the ETs about that, and they said, well, we call it the all mind. And they explained that the universe itself is, to a degree, as we would think of it, conscious, aware. So, yeah, I would say yes, there is a God, but not some old man on a throne with a beard and a big stick putting people into hell. I think that's completely distorted truth of what's really going on here. But yeah, we're all part of Source. We're all, I think, eternal beings, what we would consider to be immortal. We come down to Earth for just a short time. And people call it astral projection. When you go out of your body, it's kind of a misnomer because what we're actually doing is leaving our superior astral body where we live in perfect health and come down into a physical body, which is fragile and lasts for only a short period of time. So, yeah, we are all coming from Source, ETs, all entities. We're all interdimensional as well. Some people say, oh, ETs are interdimensional. Well, yeah, so are you. All of us are. So, yeah, short answer, I'm going to say yes, there is a God.
And I would say there is one too, because I survived a very close to death experience that I shouldn't have survived a few years ago, although I never had an out of body experience during that time, which was a little disappointing. But I appreciate all your time that you gave us today and answering all my questions and the fans' questions. Where can people look up more information on your books, which, by the way, I've been putting them on the screen throughout this, if any of the fans are wondering what those books were?
Yeah, thanks, Devin. I appreciate that. Yeah, and thanks for having me on the show. I think this subject is really important to all of them. I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. My books are on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, other online retailers. I have a website as well. Just punch in my name, it'll take you there. I have a YouTube channel. I'm on all the forms of, well, not all of them, there's so many, but a lot of the social media out there. I do my own podcast with Dolly Saffron each Monday evening from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern called The Light Gate. So you can check us out there. Yeah, thanks again for having me on the show. I'm so excited to see this subject getting serious coverage now. So many people are being brought into this field that never really thought about it before. So it's a new era for humanity as this subject is going mainstream or close to it.